What devotion can twist the sacred vows of a holy man into a noose of his own making? What secret burns so brightly in the shadows of a chapel that it consumes both sinner and saint alike? Before we descend into the depths of this tale, I ask you to remain with us. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more haunting stories drawn from the dark corners of history. Your presence gives these forgotten voices life once again. The year was 1847. In a small town in Georgia, framed by cypress trees and the heavy scent of magnolia, there stood a whitewashed church at the edge of the plantation fields. Its wooden cross gleamed in the sunlight by day, but at night, its shadows stretched across the ground like reaching hands. The church was led by Reverend Thomas Grayson, a man whose sermons echoed with fire and conviction, whose voice filled the rafters with promises of salvation, and whose Bible seemed to weigh heavier than any whip. To the congregation, he was a figure of stern righteousness, a shepherd guiding his flock. To his wife, Eleanor, he was a distant husband, cold, controlled, and rarely home except for meals and sleep. But to one young enslaved woman named Celeste, he was something far more dangerous. Celeste was no ordinary presence in the Reverend's household. She had been taken from her mother as a child and raised in the Grayson estate as a servant. By the time she reached her 17th year, she had become a quiet beauty with eyes as deep and sorrowful as midnight itself. She moved through the house like a whisper, her hands skilled in mending, cooking, and tending to Eleanor's endless demands. But in the stolen hours after midnight, when the house was wrapped in silence and the world beyond the plantation slept, the Reverend would steal away from his marital bed. He would drift like a ghost down the wooden staircase, past the creaking pews of his own empty chapel, and into the quarters where Celeste lay. No scripture, no oath, no holy word kept him from her. The love he bore, or the sin he indulged, grew like a flame, small at first but fanned by secrecy until it threatened to engulf everything around it. Celeste, trapped in his shadow, bore the torment of a woman torn between survival and damnation. To resist was unthinkable. To accept was unbearable. The Reverend believed himself hidden, his duplicity masked by the facade of piety. But eyes in a small southern town see more than lips admit. Eleanor, his wife, began to notice the traces, the way her husband's hands trembled during sermons, the faint scent of another upon his clothes, the hollow coldness in their marriage bed. And the congregation noticed as well, how Celeste avoided his gaze in the daylight, how his sermons grew erratic, trembling, as though guilt seeped into every word he spoke. On Sunday mornings, when the bells rang and the townsfolk gathered in their stiff black coats and bonnets, whispers began to swirl beneath the hymns. Whispers of scandal. Whispers of a preacher who had broken his vows, not just to his wife, but to the God he claimed to serve. Eleanor grew pale with suspicion, her eyes sharp and restless. She followed him with the silent fury of a woman scorned, watching, waiting. And Celeste, she too felt the noose tightening. Her dreams were haunted by visions of fire, of mobs with torches, of her body dragged through the streets as punishment for sins she did not choose. It was a fragile house of secrets, and all it needed was one gust of wind to bring it crashing down. That gust came in the form of a single letter. Eleanor found it tucked within the pages of her husband's Bible one morning, a folded scrap of paper with words scribbled in hurried ink. Words not written by her hand, nor by any righteous man of God. They spoke of midnight meetings, of whispered promises, of stolen touches beneath the weight of the cross. They spoke of Celeste. The blood drained from Eleanor's face as she read. Her fingers trembled, but her heart hardened into stone. In that moment, she vowed that her husband's betrayal would not remain hidden. It would not be quietly forgiven. It would be dragged into the light of day, and the cost would be unimaginable. The Reverend prayed louder that week, his voice breaking as he thundered from the pulpit. He spoke of sin, of temptation, of damnation. His words scorched the air, but the townsfolk heard the tremor beneath them. They heard the guilt, the fear, the frantic strain of a man preaching to himself more than to anyone else. Celeste shrank into herself, her presence quieter than ever, her eyes refusing to meet Eleanor's. But the mistress of the house watched her with a gaze like ice, sharp enough to pierce flesh. Eleanor said nothing, but silence is more dangerous than words. And as the church bell tolled on the eve of Sunday, the town prepared for another sermon. But what awaited them was not salvation. It was the unmasking of a scandal that would leave blood upon the altar and whispers in the rafters for generations to come. What happens when a man of God stands before his congregation, not as a shepherd, but as a wolf whose sins are about to be laid bare? The Sunday morning sun broke through the stained glass windows of the church, painting the pews in shards of crimson and gold. The bell tower groaned as the rope was pulled, its toll reverberating across the fields, calling the town to worship. But among the footsteps that filed into the sanctuary, there was a tension in the air, an unspoken expectation like the hush before a storm. At the pulpit, Reverend Grayson clutched his Bible as though it were a shield. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. Eleanor sat in the front pew, her hands folded neatly, her bonnet casting a shadow that could not hide the fury in her gaze. Beside her sat Celeste, silent, head bowed, trembling as though the very walls pressed in on her. The Reverend began his sermon, his voice rising in desperate fervor. He preached of loyalty, of obedience, of purity. His words dripped with urgency, as though he could bind his own crumbling house together with Scripture alone. But the congregation shifted uneasily. They heard something else beneath his voice. Guilt, panic, the quiver of a man cornered by his own hypocrisy. Then Eleanor rose. The silence was immediate. No wife of a preacher ever interrupted a sermon. But Eleanor's voice, sharp and unyielding, cut through the sanctuary like a blade. "This man," she declared, her finger pointing toward her husband, "stands before you as a liar. He has broken his vows, not only to me but to God himself. He has defiled the sanctity of this pulpit with sin." Gasps rippled through the pews. The Reverend's face blanched, his mouth opening in protest, but Eleanor was not finished. From her bonnet she withdrew the folded letter, the evidence she had found, and held it high for all to see. "He has lain with that girl," she hissed, her eyes falling upon Celeste, "that slave whom he pretends to shepherd. He has dragged the devil into this holy place." The church erupted in chaos. Voices rose, chairs scraped, hands clutched at Bibles and rosaries as though salvation might be snatched away. Celeste, shaking, pressed herself into the wooden pew, her face wet with tears she could not contain. The Reverend staggered from the pulpit, his voice breaking. "It is not as you believe. I was tempted, yes, but I sought only to save her soul. I am a man of God, I." But his words fell to the floor like shattered glass. The townsfolk's faith unraveled before their eyes. They no longer saw a preacher. They saw a hypocrite, a man who wielded Scripture as a mask for his own desires. A deacon rose from the back, his voice trembling with rage. "You dare defile this house. You dare call yourself holy while committing such wickedness. You've cursed us all with your sin." The mob stirred, voices overlapping, accusations hurling like stones. Eleanor's face burned with triumph, but her satisfaction was cold, laced with venom. She had not merely revealed her husband's betrayal, she had set fire to his very soul in front of those who once revered him. Celeste was seized by two women, dragged from her seat as though she were the devil incarnate. She pleaded, sobbed, but mercy was not in their eyes. She was a scapegoat, the vessel of his sin, and the town would not let her leave unpunished. The Reverend lunged forward, shouting, "No! Leave her be. If blame lies anywhere, it lies with me." But his cries only deepened their disgust. For here was a holy man throwing away his ministry, his marriage, and his God for the sake of an enslaved girl. Outside the church, the mob swelled. Celeste's cries echoed against the clapboard walls, her body forced to kneel in the dirt. They whispered of fire, of lashes, of justice that was nothing more than cruelty in disguise. The Reverend fell to his knees before them, hands clasped, begging for her life. His wife watched, her lips a thin line, unmoved. And then violence erupted. A stone flew from the crowd, striking the Reverend across the temple. Blood poured down his cheek as he collapsed, his Bible falling from his grasp. The mob roared, emboldened, fists and boots colliding with flesh. The man who had once commanded the souls of a town was reduced to a beaten figure in the mud, his prayers drowned out by jeers. Celeste, too, was struck, pulled, bound, and dragged toward the river that wound like a serpent beyond the fields. They spoke of cleansing, of baptism by force, though their intentions were nothing but cruel vengeance. Eleanor followed at a distance, her eyes glinting with satisfaction that masked a deeper madness. The Reverend, battered and bleeding, staggered after them, his voice hoarse. "Please, spare her. Take me instead." But the mob was deaf to his pleas. At the riverbank, beneath the shadow of the cypress trees, Celeste was forced into the water. Her screams pierced the night as hands pushed her beneath the surface. The Reverend threw himself forward, clawing, fighting, desperate to reach her, but strong arms held him back. He was forced to watch as bubbles rose, then faded, until the river returned to stillness. When at last the mob released him, he fell into the water, pulling her lifeless body into his arms. He cradled her there, rocking as though she were a child, his cries echoing through the night air. His congregation stood in silence, the fire of their fury spent, replaced by a haunting recognition of what they had done. By morning the church was abandoned. The pews stood empty, the pulpit silent. Reverend Grayson was never seen again in the town of Georgia. Some say he drowned himself in that same river, unable to bear the loss of the woman he loved. Others whispered that he wandered the backroads like a ghost, preaching to the trees, his mind fractured beyond repair. As for Eleanor, she remained in the house alone, her triumph souring into bitterness. The people who once pitied her now avoided her door, for they could not forget the madness in her eyes as she watched her husband fall. And Celeste, her name was never spoken aloud again. But on quiet nights, when the cypress swayed and the river shimmered silver beneath the moon, townsfolk swore they could hear her voice singing, a mournful hymn carried on the wind. The Reverend's love had cost them all. A wife consumed by vengeance, a preacher destroyed by desire, and a young woman swallowed by the river, yet never forgotten. And so, the tale lingers, not as a sermon of salvation, but as a ghost story of betrayal, love, and ruin. If you endured this haunting tale to its end, remember to give this story a like. It helps keep these forgotten voices alive, so that history's shadows are never silenced again.